I was coming to the end of my quest.
I didn't just drive to Norfolk, I spooled down the years back in time to an indistinct age caught halfway between verifiable history and legend, to the Dark Ages, and to one man in particular who may never even have existed, to Arthur. I went to see one of the elder statesmen of the genre, the writer and poet Kevin Crossley Holland, whose own Arthurian trilogy has been translated into over 25 languages, and it tells the story of Arthur through the eyes of a boy of the same name, living hundreds of years later in medieval Britain. There is something of the Magus about Kevin to my mind, and it's no accident that he recently played the part of Merlin in the Story Museum in Oxford. It's a fitting place being here. These flat shores seem ideal even now to run a longboat up and forge inland to raid and to settle. But the Saxon raiders sweeping across from this eastern coast were checked by Arthur, apparently, at the Battle of Mount Badon, that a slim majority have down as Salisbury Hill in Bath. Throughout the making of this programme, Arthur's name kept cropping up. At times he seems everywhere, his story rooted in this land from Carlisle to Cornwall, Cardigan to Colchester. And it's not just that stories of his battles seem to cover the country. Arthur the man seems to speak more to the imagination than anyone I can think of in what is an extraordinary host of forceful characters. He seems to have all the best themes: the fight against good and evil, honour, courage, mystical religion and magic. And with the best sidekick in literary history, Merlin, and the best accessories, Excalibur and the Grail, amongst others.
There was a man who fought 12 great battles, well reported, before very long, against the Saxons, the great enemies of the Celts. And they were fought, culminating in a battle at somewhere called Mons Badonicus, which could be Baden Castle in Dorset. Wherever and whatever, the truth of all that, these battles held up the Saxons, perhaps for a generation. My sense is that with the great historical figures, they become like magnets, and all kinds of bits and pieces gravitate to them, and that there was a leader, a Celtic leader, perhaps with Welsh, perhaps with Strathclyde connections, who did stop the Saxons. And there are tiny little chips of information, little hints. In the same way, the birth records of North Wales for the 6th, 7th, 8th century show that quite suddenly the name Arthur was being very, very much more widely used. Why? It's that kind of little hint that suggests that there was indeed a historical figure. But you couldn't possibly call him a king, of course not. You'd call him, I suppose, an Iron Age warlord. He probably had arthritis. He probably lived on the top of somewhere like Maiden Castle in Dorset or Cadbury Castle in Somerset. He had a group of fanatically loyal followers, and he was committed to driving back the Saxons from, well, we call them Saxons, but actually they were Angles and Saxons and Frisians and Jutes, all coming in different groups into Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent, Hampshire, and then moving inland up the river systems. But he has nothing whatsoever to do with the Romance figure of the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, who is the Arthur who's familiar to most of us. Different authors took the stories of Arthur for their own reasons. But if you start looking at Arthur through the centuries, because he has this extraordinary gift of changing and representing himself, you see him as tetchy, you see him as old, you see him as young, you see him as rather weak, you see him as thrusting. And of course, by the time you get to Tennyson and Ideals of the King, he is the sort of embodiment of family values, a good Victorian figure. And in the 20th century, probably more than any previous century, he's presented in all kinds of guises.
Does Arthur then represent an idealised version of how the British see themselves?
I think Arthur represents a dream. If you're asking what is the role of Arthur in relation to the British, again, it's a changing one in most respects, except that he is the dream, he is the embodiment, he's the hub of a better time, an ideal time, a golden age. It's what we can aspire to in our own lives. There are actually, couple of hundred places associated with Arthur in Great Britain, all over the shop, and very well summarised in a book by Derek Brewer called Arthur's Britain, I think it was. But David Jones's lines are the ones that stick in my mind. They're not quite well enough for me to memorise them, but nevertheless, I'm just going to read you a very few. Yet he sleeps on. Very deep is his slumber. How long has he been the sleeping lord? Are the clammy ferns his rustling valance? Does the buried rowan ward him from evil, or does he ward the tanglewood? And the denizens of the wood, are the stunted oaks his gnarled guard, or are the gnarled limbs strong with his sap? And then crucially, are the slumbering valleys, think of the valleys of Wales, for instance, rising and falling, are the slumbering valleys him in slumber? Are the still undulations the still limbs of him sleeping? Does the land wait the sleeping Lord, or is the wasted land that very Lord who sleeps?
Stuck on the M11 driving back from Norfolk, it dawned on me that I really didn't care whether Arthur existed or not as a man. The fact is, I think he's best curated by the storytellers. As Kevin was saying, Arthur is better as an idea, a blueprint for Britishness, ruthless when called upon, but a unifier of a nation, a forger of law and honour in this melting pot of a country.